Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Merci de nous avoir joindre. Welcome to the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences webinar on Publishing with the Conversation Canada. Juste pour noter, la session se déroulera en anglais, mais vous pouvez poser vos questions dans les deux langues. Let's begin with today's agenda. After a bit of housekeeping, I'll introduce our speaker. And our speaker will present for about 30 minutes to explain the new journalism model, to give a live demonstration of how academic authors get access to the detailed analytics that they provide. We'll wrap up with a Q&A session, for which we'll reserve 20 minutes at the end. So in terms of housekeeping, you may submit questions at any time using the question box on your screen. Submit them, and then you can also close or open your box with the orange arrows. Go to ideaside.ca/webinars for troubleshooting if you need to see our FAQs, and we'll post both the slides and the video to our website by the end of the day. On to introductions. My name is Nicola Katz. I'm Acting Director of Policy Programs, Communication and Membership here at the Federation. I'll be your moderator today, and I'm joined by Scott White, editor of the Conversation Canada. Previously, he was Editor-in-Chief of the Canadian Press and Vice President of Content Strategy and Business Development at the Postmedia Network. He has an MBA from the Rotman School of Management and at the University of Toronto, and is a graduate of the journalism program at Ryerson University. The Federation is keen to find ways to enable peer-to-peer learning across our membership, and we're running these webinars on topics of interest to scholars in our community. After the webinar, a survey will come to you, and it's your chance to let us know if we hit the mark. And now let me turn the mic over to Scott.
Thank you, Nicola, and welcome to everyone across Canada. As Nicola said, I'm going to, I have a PowerPoint here that will last about 15 minutes, and then I'm going to do some live demonstrations of the website and the analytics, which I think from an author prospective author's point of view is sort of the really interesting part of the conversation. So let me start off. I've been a journalist for more than 30 years. As Nicola said, I spent most of my career with the Canadian Press News Service. And I read this book called The Purpose of Journalism, or The Elements of Journalism, about 15 or 20 years ago. And there was this one sentence that always sort of jumped out at me. And this is my personal sort of mantra of what I think journalism is. It's just my opinion, but it's something that's always sort of driven me in my career. And it's basically that journalism should provide truthful, reliable information so that people can make up their own minds about the things that are important to them in life. So not to preach, not to tell you what to think, but to give the public information where they can make up their own mind, to be self-governing in a sense. So this can be anything from, what movie should I go see tonight, to I've got some major health issues I'm dealing with, and there's contrary evidence and research out there, and you give them the best information they can so they can make up their own mind. So as I say, this has always been something that I think is really important as an element of actually a democratic society. But at a time when people need strong journalism more than ever, the business model of journalism is really suffering, as you probably know, both in newspapers and private broadcasters, and even websites like Yahoo, who started off by being dependent on digital advertising for revenue. Even those models are now being disrupted. So if the journalism models are broken, and that means that they're starting to lay off journalists and getting rid of their science reporters and their education reporters and environment reporters, how does that knowledge get out to the public? So what the conversation is this new model where you have the academics at the universities who have this knowledge, and my small and dedicated team of editors who are journalists who have subject matter expertise, and they work together. So the missing middle person here, it would be the science reporter, the environmental reporter. So now we're getting the information right from the academics, working with journalists to translate it into knowledge and information for the general public so they can understand. And that's the model of the conversation. The conversation actually started in Australia in 2011, where the media landscape is very similar to what's happened in Canada. It's a concentrated ownership, and as the for-profit media tried to maintain its profit levels, the one way they were doing it was cutting. So there was an editor from one of the newspapers there who had gone to work in academia and said, why don't we try this new thing? It took off. Started in Australia in 2011, and it's since gone to Great Britain, the US, France, Africa, and Indonesia, and then came to Canada here in last June, which I'll explain a little bit more. So academics can pitch articles, and we're going to go into more detail on this. So if academics have ideas, they can approach us in a couple of different ways. Or we have ideas from our newsroom, and then we'll go out and find academics to write about it. And our subject matters are wide. It's like all news sites. We have science, health and medicine, education, technology, politics, arts, economics, business, energy, environment, and culture and society. So we cover pretty much the whole spectrum of what the public would be interested in. I guess if you compare it to a traditional news site, the one area that we don't have is sports, but we actually do publish a lot of sort of the science of sports or some cultural issues around sports or the politics of sports. And if you're doing any research in those areas, we're very much interested. As a matter of fact, we have two pieces coming up in the next week about the Commonwealth Games, which are about to start in Australia. One about it's going to be the first multi-sport games where, for the first time ever, there are actually going to be as many medals awarded to women athletes as there are males. So it's a huge step in gender equality. And we have a researcher from Ryerson who wrote several pieces about the Olympics, and she's a former Canadian national athlete, and so she talks about how, from the athlete's perspective, and some research that she's doing around performance. So there's lots of ways we can work with you if you've got an interesting idea. So we started at the end of June last year, so we're not even around for a year yet. We've published well north of 600 articles. We're publishing about 4 articles a day, 5 times a week. Some days we do 3, some days we do 5, and our content has already been viewed more than 9 million times. So we've been actually a bit stunned about how much it's taken off. And one of the real, I think, from both a knowledge mobilization perspective and also just from a journalism perspective, is that everything that we publish is under Creative Commons license. And that means that anybody can use it. So we also, Lisa Verano, who's our audience development editor, who does all of our social media, so we promote it obviously on the social channels. Facebook and Twitter are the two we focus on mostly. But Lisa also spends half of her day taking each story and essentially shopping it around. And I use the term shopping in a generic sense because it doesn't cost them anything. So finding publications both in Canada and then using the Conversation Global Network from around the world who would be interested in publishing it. So for instance, we had a really interesting piece earlier this winter about some new research about the Greenland shark that was done by Memorial University in Newfoundland. And it was really well written. It was very interesting. People love sharks. So she talked to the Smithsonian magazine, and it got picked up, and the story got over 100,000 views. So it's a great way to sort of get that out. Within Canada, the Canadian Press is publishing all of our articles, and virtually every news organization in Canada is publishing us, with the exception of CBC and the Globe, and we're in pretty serious discussions with CBC. The Globe is probably not, but we do know that the Globe and Mail reads our content every day, and their science writer gets ideas from it, and it is also their opinion editors will sometimes approach our authors and say, you wrote this for the conversation, can you write a piece for us? So we don't care. If in my previous life, I never liked it when Canadian Press did a story and somebody kind of stole the story and did it, because we see this very much. Our mission is to promote knowledge, awareness, and if it's getting out in a different way, we're fine with that. The other thing is, I would say probably at least half of our authors are interviewed by other media or do radio or TV appearances once their articles have appeared. So it is, interestingly enough, even though CBC isn't publishing the articles, they are regularly interviewing our people who've written for us, have been on the National, the Current, local morning and afternoon shows on a regular basis, and we hear from the authors all the time. So we've got more than, probably closer now to 900 registered academic authors who can write for us, and I'll explain that process in a moment here. So I'm very proud of the work that we're doing. The one area I would think that makes the Conversation Canada a little bit unique from the other ones, because everybody has a science section, everybody has a politics and an environment section. We created this culture and society section because when I started this, we wanted to, there was so many things around gender politics, gender equality, reconciliation, Indigenous issues that we wanted to, and we knew there's a lot of academic research around there that isn't in the mainstream media. So Vanita Srivastava, who's our culture and society editor, worked at the New York Times, taught journalism at Ryerson, and has a critical race academic background, oversees this section, and we're very proud of the work that's being done there. People who either wouldn't want to write for traditional media because there's some major trust issues, or just haven't been given the opportunity because traditional media isn't aware of them. So we're getting a lot of really good stories published there. The other thing I want to mention at this point is that the Conversation Canada is possible because two UBC professors, Mary Lynn Young and Alfred Hermida, have been working on this for about 2 years to get it up to this sort of launch period, which we started last June. So they've done tremendous work, and actually, interestingly enough, are doing a sort of a side research project about academia and journalism, and so in some ways we're a bit of a lab for them as well. So it's a really interesting project. So the other thing that we found that's really interesting about our audience, because we started with nothing, we knew what some of the other conversations were doing, but we didn't know how it would be received in Canada and what kind of uptake there would be from both people who wanted to write for us and also from the audience itself. So a couple of things here that I find really surprising. So this slide shows Google Analytics data from our on-site audience, reminding you that about 70% of our views come through republishers. So when a conversation piece is on Maclean's, we can tell you how many people in Maclean's read the piece, but I can't tell you a lot about Maclean's demographics because they don't share that information with us. But I think this is probably representative of the general audience. I always say that we're, because we're writing longer, sort of more in-depth and interesting pieces, that I would say we're sort of at the higher end of the news consumer, people who would read the Globe and Mail, who go to CBC for information, and some of the specialty sites. around science and energy and environment. Those are the type of readers that I think we attract. So only about 50% of our readers come from Canada. So this is the advantage of being in this international network that we're part of, this global conversation. Because, you know, if we publish a piece in the Conversation Australia or the Conversation UK says, well, that's a really interesting piece that I'd like our readers to do, then they will put it on their site, and then we get the eyeball. When it doesn't matter where somebody reads it, it comes back to us. So about 50% in Canada and then 50% outside of Canada. We have a fairly, a little more male than female audience breakdown. Interestingly enough, our author breakdown is 57% male, 43% female, which by media standards is high. We're obviously trying to have a 50-50 range. And if we probably took politics and business out, it would be much closer to being 50-50, because those two areas still tend to be dominated by male academics. The average time spent on the site is almost 3 minutes, which again by media standards is actually quite long, because the way that people tend to consume news now is that they jump back and forth from one site to another. The other thing that's not showing here, but we know, is that well more than 50% of the people who are coming in to read our stuff are doing it on a phone. So this whole myth in journalism that existed for years is that you have to write short because people are starting to read on phones and they're not going to read long on phones is absolutely not true. And I think all of you may understand that, just how your own news consumption habits have changed over the years. For many of us, the phone is now our primary way that we actually read. Certainly news and information, and man, I've read novels on phones. It's not the easiest thing to do, but it's convenient. The other thing in the bottom chart there, which is a little hard to see, is our age demographics. So the middle three bars are ages 25, 35, and 45. So again, that's by media standards is a very young audience, and it's a very diverse age-wise. Most traditional media is 50 plus. So we like the fact that we are really out there with attracting a younger audience. So I think that's very exciting. So these are some of the things that we find we didn't know what it was going to be like, and so we're very happy with that. So we launched the English site in last June. We have published French language academics in Canada. We have a deal with the Conversation France, but we are now actively trying to raise funds to have a La Conversation Canada, where French language academics in Canada would have their own site. Our plan would be to have a couple of editors working based in Montreal, and it would be the same thing, and then a lot of cross translation. The Quebec universities that we've spoken to so far are interested in doing this, and they want to get their research known outside of Quebec and even outside of Canada. So the ability for us to translate it and get it around the world, and then also to work with the Conversation France, which has a very large audience as well. So we hope this will happen. Anyone who's living in the world of Quebec academia knows that they haven't had a tuition increase, and our funding model is primarily trying to get the universities to fund this. So we feel good about this, but we can't go forward until we get some funding from mostly from Quebec that we're looking for there. So actually, our first year we had 18 universities, so we're just starting our second year, April 1st, and I'm happy to report that we've now have 25 universities supporting us. So this has been great. The reason they do this is the universities, they're interested, again, most of you will probably know this, is that universities more and more need to be able to show knowledge mobilization, which I have to admit was a term I had 11 months ago. I got hired about 10 and a half months ago. 11 months ago, I'd never heard of the term. I've obviously heard of the words, but I didn't understand the term. And it's this whole idea, there's all this amazing research is going on at Canadian universities. How does the public become aware of it? So it's not just peer-reviewed, it's getting it out, wider distribution, non-academic audience. So we are a perfect vehicle to do that. Yeah, and the other thing that we're doing is, because we do publish articles by PhD students, is we really like the fact that we're able to help early career researchers get out there and be known for the first time. The universities who fund us get access to some analytic dashboards, which I'm going to show you in a moment. My staff and I will go in and do workshops and say, you know, it can be something like, here's how to write, you know, for the general public or specifically for the conversation, or if you've got a specific goal around knowledge mobilization that you're trying to promote within the university, how can we complement you and things like that. The other thing I want to make clear is that although we get most of our funding from universities, if your university is not a funding partner, we will still publish you. And that's how we maintain our journalism, our journalistic independence. So just like academic freedom is important for academics, for us, journalistic independence is important. So the universities who fund us can't say, we want this published. It still has to go through our own vetting process, regardless of whether you are a funder or not. So no more influence if you are a funder, no less influence if you're not. Of course, what we like is when the academics from our non-funding universities get on board and start spreading the word, and then next thing you know, we hear from somebody in the VP of Research office who says, hey, you know, can we find out more about this? So here's the full list of our including some we've just added in the last month or so, including Thompson Rivers and Kamloops has come on, York, Simon Fraser, Bishops, Carleton, and Western as well. So it's really, we're very, very happy with the growth in this. Our goal is to be sort of economically sustainable by the end of our third year. So we're just entering our second, and we're feeling pretty good about it. So what's in it for academics to do? Maybe I'll save a question that we're going to get later, is do we pay you? We don't pay for it. And we absolutely respect people who don't want to write if we're not paying. We've had probably about half a dozen out of the 600 or 700 pieces that we publish say, if you're not paying, I'm not going to write. Absolutely respect you. What we've heard from the academics is that what they get through their dashboard analytics is more valuable to them than a couple $100, which you might get from some other publication, because they now turn that for the granting bodies, and especially SSHRC more and more is saying demonstrate knowledge mobilization. And so we give them real data that they can use. And that's, so this is what we're hearing from the academics. Of course, they also, you know, there's several other reasons why you just want to get your research out there. You can also use to connect with other researchers in other countries. So we've seen that happen, is that somebody says they're doing research in this, and then they in turn hear from another researcher saying, I read your article in the conversation, can we collaborate? So there's lots of different ways people can connect, and why they also publish. So who can write? So a couple of basic things for us is you have to be a researcher or an academic with a Canadian university. So that's a professor, associate, adjunct, emeritus, emerita, postdoc, PhD candidates can write, and on occasion we will have articles by master students, but in that case they have to have one of their professors as a co-author. The other thing that's important is that we only take submissions from people who are writing about their areas of expertise. So they could be writing about their own research, or certainly it's about an area of research that they are familiar with as a professor. So for instance, let me give you an example. Let's say I'm a journalism professor and I want to write a piece about how Donald Trump made this massive mistake by pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord. So the conversation would say to me, well, sorry, Scott, you're a journalism professor. Help us understand how that is aligned with your area of expertise. So if you were to submit a proposal about how Trump is harming democracy by yelling fake news, and you can cite some, it's not just an opinion, but some research about that, whether it's your own or research you're familiar with, that's great. So it's sort of, the questions that we ask when we get submissions, and most of the time it's not an issue, but like, are you with a university? Because we have had several queries from colleges, community colleges, and some standalone research institutes, like, can we write? And we have to say, no, our model is just now you have to be affiliated with the university. And then it's like, help us understand how this is aligned with your area of expertise. The first thing that you have to do to be able to write for us is it's right on the home page, and I'll show you that in a moment. You have to register as an author. It's a really simple process. And we basically ask you to fill in a couple of things, your name, your email address, and then basically cut and paste the information from your existing bio at the universities. It takes, and for some people who, if you have trouble with that, we can do it for you. And then once you're set up in the system, then it's much, first of all, you have to be registered to publish, and then as I'll show you in a moment, that's how we actually do the writing and editing. You have to be in the system to do it. So what topics can I write about? So we're just looking for interesting stuff. As I said, first of all, is it your area of expertise? Do you have the ability to translate tricky issues for other people? So again, this is nothing original, but one of the things that we'll often say is, okay, let's say you move into a new neighborhood and you're out on your front lawn and your neighbor comes over and she says, what do you do? Oh, I'm at Carleton. Well, what do you do at Carleton? And then if you can explain that in a minute, then you can probably write for us. One of the things that we found is that you have so much knowledge, and that sometimes we found people seem to be overwhelmed that they just know so much about a topic they couldn't ever imagine, like, what should I write about this, because my knowledge is so wide and so deep. And that's where our editors can come in and say, well, you know what, it's like, tell me about it. And a lot of times when we get a pitch, which again, I'll show you how that happens, we get a pitch that will quite often, some of our editors actually like to do a follow-up phone call so that they actually know, and we sort of get it down, because the last thing we want you to do is to write something and it's just kind of off the mark, and it gets frustrating for you and frustrating for us. So if we have a better understanding of sort of exactly the area you want to write about within your area of expertise, that's really the best way for us to do it. Will it work for a broad Canadian or international audience? And again, we help with the editing into plain language. And then there's the concept of the news hook. So not every story needs a news hook, but we definitely find with the republishers is that they like it when a news hook. So a news hook means, for instance, in advance of International Women's Day, we ran about 6 stories leading up to it, because we had a flood of people who wanted to write about it, and obviously there was a specific day. We had a piece that we published Sunday night about the Junos, and about how they had a shameful history of ignoring Canadian hip hop as a legitimate art form. And the author had done some research on that, and they finally sort of on the Junos on Sunday night kind of honored a sort of a major hip hop song that actually won a Juno 20 years ago, but they wouldn't let them perform during the telecast. So that was, again, very, very timely. But it doesn't always need a news hook. Some of our most published stories, or most viewed stories, are just kind of just great general reads, right? So you don't need to have a news hook. The other thing is that we can help with that. So if you've got an idea, and many of the academics are working with their communications departments at their schools, at their universities, and those people are really smart about figuring out what's the news hook. So at this point, and I'm hoping this works now, I'm going to actually switch. Getting the thumbs up that you can actually see the website, so I'm hoping that's the case. So here we are today, our front page today. We had this is a very interesting piece here about from a couple of U of T about that there's some new technology that's actually helping to identify people who might be at risk for suicide. So using AI to identify potential risk and then obviously trying to prevent it. This is another one actually about the university sector, also from U of T, I believe. Sorry. About the pay gap that's going on between male and female academics. So as you can see, we're not afraid to publish so-called controversial things, even though we get our funding from universities. So as you can see, we have all these different sections. Some of the content that we're on here is written by us, and others is from so this is one that we would have got from the US, I believe. So we do tap into this global network to really help us. As I mentioned, this is the culture and society section that we're very, so this is an interesting piece we had actually from an academic in the UK who had heard about the troubles that both the Prime Minister and the NDP leader have been having around Sikh extremism. And so he'd done some research in Britain about it and then said, here's what my research can, maybe Canadians could learn from that. So very interesting piece that. You'll notice that we put a lot of emphasis on imagery and on headlines. I'd say the single sort of thing that we probably have the most, I won't say arguments, but sort of debates with the authors is the headlines. So we put a lot of thought into our headlines. There's things like search engine optimization that will do it. That will be really important to make sure that the article's read, and obviously imagery. So we will accept photos, especially videos. If you've done research videos, we usually always will use the videos. But for the lead image, we need something that kind of jumps out at people. We have access to Canadian Press, Associated Press photos, as well as some stock photo services. So I wanted to just show you the how it works. So this is Thomas Merritt from Laurentian. He's written a number of articles for us, and I'm sort of showing you somebody who's, so as you'll see in each one of these, every article has the author's bio there, and there's a disclosure statement where we ask people to self-identify, any funding they get or any other potential, not a conflict of interest, but just so that we really encourage people to be totally transparent about where they're getting their funding, so that, again, the public can make up its own mind about whether they think that's influencing your point of view, which it probably is. So let's just be transparent about it. So again, here's Thomas at Laurentian. you can click on his bio. So this is, he's registered and he's put all this in here in his bio, which is probably exactly the same thing as on his university one. And then it shows you the articles that he's published. One of his was translated into French. This is a very interesting piece that he wrote about male bias in labs, which leads to almost all species that are being researched on are the male species. And he says it's leads to problems down the road when it comes into human, when humans start benefiting from the research. So you can click on each, this isn't something the public sees, but as a registered author, then you can visit your dashboard, and here's Thomas's dashboard. And he's had some pretty amazing success. So this is a piece he did about why are you left-handed or right-handed. And then you can see all the places that this has been published: IFL Science, Salon, Business Insider. And then this was the one that, until very recently, was our most published story: how to kill fruit flies, according to a scientist. And I'm convinced it was the last part of that headline, which was the most important, is according to a scientist, because you can Google lots of articles on how to kill fruit flies, which he basically gives you the same advice as you'd find elsewhere. But he also explained, because we asked him to tell us why do so many biologists work with fruit flies. And so it's a little bit of a history of why fruit flies are used in science. And again, this one got tremendous use. People may laugh about the Weather Network, but to be honest with you, it's one of the most read sites in Canada in terms of science and climate and environment. So anything that we publish about those areas and or animal research, they lap it up, they love it. Washington Post used this. So again, it's you can see this, and then the other thing he can see is it gives him a breakdown here, and also where it's used internationally. So I'm going to switch now. The screen that you're seeing now is all of the stories that we have in our system. So once let me come back to here for a moment. So on the website, they're down on the right-hand side. It says, do you want to write? Now, when I click on here, it's going to show I'm already registered, but that's how you register as an author. So you go on there, and then once you're registered, then there's if you want to pitch an idea, so you would click here, yes, because you've already registered, and then this is the form that more and more now that people are sending. So sometimes people will just email us directly, but this is where you pitch an idea. And if you can see here, the first thing is we're asking you in 50 words or less to tell us what your story is about. And sometimes that's a challenge for people. So if you can't tell us in 50 words or less what you want to write about, we may have problems down the road, but most people are very good about this. The next one is the significance. So it gives you a little more chance to tell us on why it's interesting. And then is it timely, yes or no? And then where do you think it fits? You submit that, and then we get an email that automatically goes to the right editor. And then just before we start the Q&A, I just wanted to show you how it is. So here's so just so you know, the color code for us means the purple ones are ready to be published, the green ones have been resubmitted to the authors, because the key point that I want to make with you is that we cannot publish until you've signed off on everything. So it's very much transparent, so you can see there's a whole system here on, you can slide this back and forth, and then as the author, before it's published, you can click on the preview and you get to see, are you okay with the photo? Are you okay with the headline? And just so you know, this is what it will look like when it's online. So again, I know one of the things that we hear from academics when dealing with the media is, geez, I spent half an hour on the phone, they use 3 sentences from a quote, and they, in my opinion, picked the wrong quote. So this way you have complete sign-off, and it's under your name. And again, we hear from people that's what they really, really like about this system. So Nicola, at this point, shall we switch back and start some questions?
Yes, thank you, Scott, for sharing in such detail how to publish with your outlet and the power of your analytics dashboard. This is especially important with Congress coming up. As we all know, there's a tremendous amount of research getting presented at Congress, and this is a really great platform that may be another way to push out Congress material. Scott will now take questions from participants. We have some questions coming in through the question box. And the first one is, I'll read the question and then turn it over to you, Scott. How difficult is it for the conversation to turn academic writing, in quotes, into more reader-friendly format?
So when we started 11 months ago, 10 months ago, we were asking ourselves that question, and we'd had some training from other conversations around the world, and I went down to the Conversation US. And the simple answer is it's not as difficult as we thought, and I think most of the experience that we've had from our authors is it's not difficult on their end. So again, so the first tip I would have for anybody is make sure that you read the site. So we've had a couple of people who've sent in very, very academic, like more like you would have in a peer-reviewed journal. And we'll say to them, okay, again, if you could go back, like this type of writing isn't what you see in the site. So go and read the site and be familiar with what it is. Generally, most of our times it takes, we plan roughly anywhere from 3 to 4 days. And much of that has to do with how busy our editors are now, because when we started, we were desperate for articles, and now we're actually almost at capacity, which is why I'm trying to grow the team. We turned articles around as quickly as 2 hours, which is unusual. But I would say mostly it's 3 or 4 days, and that requires, it's not 3 or 4 days constant. It's the author submits, we'll do a first edit, maybe the next day they'll go back in and have a look, and then there's a little bit of back and forth. But almost everyone that we've worked with have come away and told their colleagues that it's been a very positive experience for them.
Okay. We have another question here. Academics are busy. How difficult has it been for the conversation to get authors to write? You've alluded to that.
Yeah. So again, a question we didn't know anything about when we started, and we actually had a big decision. Do we start in basically at the beginning of July, when a lot of people, obviously there's not a lot of school going on, and so we decided yes, we do it because we kind of considered it a soft launch. And then but then in September, would they be busy because they're back to school? So for us, there really hasn't been a slow period, and actually one of the busiest periods we had in terms of submissions came around the holiday break at the end of the year, because people were doing this, and as there's, I guess the school breaks are different times for different schools, but like last week and the week before, we seem to get a lot of submissions. So again, it's not our biggest problem now is we are getting up to 6, 7 submissions a day now. And remembering that I have a team of basically 3.5 editors, so we're not wanting in terms of it. The thing that we found is that the first time people may find it a little bit onerous, but after that, and they tend to be working with the same editor because of the subject matter, that once they've done it once, they quite often they'll say to us, when can I write the next one? So we love to hear that.
Okay, so related to that, what is the typical or required word count for an article with the conversation?
So we ask people to try and keep it 600 to 800 words, which means that we usually get it to 800 to 1200. A lot of republishers really like stories around 600 to 800, which to me, because of its digital, I don't understand why, but we do have some newspapers who are still putting this in print. So in those cases, it's almost always around 650 to 700 words. So what we'll do in that case is we'll either, so the newspaper will contact us. So the Toronto Star will say, we want to use this, but we need to take 400 words out of it. And so we'll either seek permission from the author to say, are you all right with the Star printing this? And then we make sure that they say this is an edited version and read the full version at the conversation. Or we'll, in some cases, actually work with the author and produce a special version for 700 words or 650 words. I just think it's really sometimes it takes a little longer to tell an interesting story, but the editors will try and make it not as long. So generally, if you can aim for 800, 600 to 800, that's what we like.
Okay. Do you have an editorial calendar to which authors can have visibility, or how can they plan to publish with you?
So this is the way that we found that this has worked best is working with the communications department at their own universities who have their own editorial calendars. So again, for instance, like I think one of the most interesting pieces we had was from a Rotman professor who wrote about some research that people had done about what type of candy they gave out, and it really talked about human behavior and choices that people make. If you search Halloween on the site, you'll find the article. And it was a really interesting piece, and the problem was they didn't get it to us until the day before Halloween. If we'd had that a week before, I think it would have got much greater use. Now, the flip side of that is we've got a piece today that we published about how you can turn long weekends into a mini holiday. So some research on, basically unplugging and how, people should use long weekends more to actually feel rested and recuperated. And that one we published last night because we wanted to get it out to the republishers, and then we will then re-promote it on our website on Friday, or on Thursday actually, for depending on where you are, either a 3 or 4 day weekend. So it is, we're always looking for things, especially around politics. And we also do a thing called a call out where we'll be, so we'll go to our funding universities and say, hey, we've got these ideas around this event. For instance, when Black Panther was coming out, the movie Benita had done a lot of, looking for authors to write about Black superheroes, the influence of that from a cultural point of view, and it started looking for people weeks in advance of the release of the movie. So we'll ask that, but if you have ideas around things, so sometimes there's things going on that, we're not aware of, actually. We did a whole series on around breast cancer awareness around October when that was that. So it helps, again, it kind of comes back to the news hook, but if you've got ideas, great.
I've got a related question here. Are there any big issues that you would like to see more articles on? Issues that you haven't had articles yet?
Yeah, so not so much issues. I would say that a couple of areas that are underrepresented or we'd like more of is actually STEM. Like we still would like more STEM articles, more science articles, more energy articles. So we have a lot. So we have a section called Energy and Environment. We have lots on environment. We'd like to see more on energy because Canada is an energy powerhouse. And believe it or not, the arts, we have lots on like culture and society from a societal view, but arts as well, I think, are a little bit underrepresented. Again, we would also really like to hear from more female academics in the areas of science, business, and politics. We really are trying to get different perspectives in that area as well.
Okay. I have one more question here. What is the typical amount of time needed to edit a story? I know you alluded to it earlier, but what kind of time frames should authors have in mind when they approach you, sort of start to finish?
Yeah, start to finish is again, if it's a first time and if, so probably a week or less. Sometimes we'll say, you know what, there's no news hook for your proposal. So what we're going to do is we're going to send you a file in the system because that's the first thing we do. But you know what, we're going to put it in our calendar that we'll get in touch with you in 2 weeks, and then we're going to start the editing process. So the one thing that we're getting better at from our end is because the authors have to sign off, is that we will say, because the system is you work with a primary editor and then it goes to another copy editor, and then at that point we seek final approval. Again, we can't publish until you signed off. And so what we will say is, just so you know, we expect to ask your final permission sometime between 3 and 5 o'clock today, or, you know, because we want to publish it tonight. Sometimes we'll do it before. Most times we'll do it not the same day of, but sometimes we are doing it the same day of. So that's the one thing, is in just establishing, and our editors are very good at establishing that line of communication with you.
Okay. We've reached the end of our time for today. If there are questions that have come in that we have not answered, so we are logging those, we will respond to them by email very shortly. Thank you all for joining us for the webinar. Very special thank you for Scott for his work on this webinar and for sharing how Conversation Canada provides analytics to make this type of publishing so attractive. After the event, you'll all receive a survey, so please do fill that out. Let us know if we've hit the mark for you and if this would be useful specifically for Congress. You can share the video and the slides, which will be posted later on today, with your colleagues that may have missed this session. Have a great day, everyone. Bonne journée à tous.